Chapter 135, Before Chinese New Year's Eve. The next morning, a thin layer of skylight shone on the steps. There seemed to be some small movement in the room. The sword and piano and sword book had already been prepared for washing, and he was waiting outside, but he didn't dare to go in when he heard it, because he didn't know if Xie Wei had woken up and gotten up. Until I heard the inside suddenly ask, "What time is it?" Jianshu replied, "Chen is at the moment." There was silence for a while, and then he said, "Come in." When Xie Wei opened his eyes in the morning, he felt that the light was shining through the window paper, and his eyes were blurry. Raised his hand to his forehead and sat up, only to find that he had slept until dawn. The cold candles are gone, and there is some residual warmth in the room. Looking into the corner, the ime was quietly placed on the piano table, as if no one had moved. When the sword book and the sword chain came in, he had already gotten up and only asked, "When did Ning Er leave last night?" Jianshu said, "About Haishi." Xie Wei was silent for a while, but at the end he didn't say anything, just changed his clothes, washed up, and used some porridge and rice. Now that the rebellion of the heavenly sect has been settled, he should stay in Tongzhou for 2 days, and after taking care of the follow-up matters, he should leave for Beijing. Yesterday at dusk, there was a heavy snowfall, piled up all over the ground, and the people below replied that the official road from Tongzhou to the capital was buried by heavy snow and falling rocks, and it was still being cleaned up, and I was afraid that it would not be possible to make the trip in a day or two. In addition, Zhang Sha, Xiaoya and most of the surviving soldiers were all injured. Xie Wei listened to the following advice, and then ordered to go down and spend 2 days in Tongzhou first. Officials of all sizes heard that someone had come to Beijing early yesterday, and they all took the opportunity to come to worship today. Originally, there was a clean Shangqing temple at the door, but it was like a car flowing like a dragon, so it was not lively. Asterisk. After Zhang Xuning slipped out of Xie Wei's room last night, she originally wanted to go to see Zhang Sha by the way, but when she passed by the door of his room, she saw that the lights and candles were extinguished, and it was dark, and she thought that he was tired and exhausted from running around for days, and he should have a good sleep, so he endured it and didn't bother. When she woke up the next day, she went looking for it. Zhang Sha's complexion is naturally better than yesterday, but he is used to being silent, and the two of them have been out of danger, and they are no longer as capable of engaging in an interdependent as they are on the road. Zhang Sha abides by etiquette again, not to mention that there is a doctor's order in front of him, asking him to rest well. Zhang Xuning is not too disturbed, so he has to watch it once in the morning and once in the evening. I don't know what Zhang Sha thinks. She only felt very satisfied, but she didn't look homesick at all. She was happy all day long, her smile was always hanging, and everyone in Shangqing Guan felt comfortable when she saw her. It's just that God is really not beautiful. The Tongzhou officials made a fuss and shouted for 2 days, and Xie Wei also began to deal with the mess after the battle to eradicate the heavenly sect, and discussed things with Xiao Yuan several times, and was about to leave. The end of the year is near. If the journey had been quicker, the people would have been able to return home before the feast. Unexpectedly, it snowed heavily on the morning of the 3rd day, and news came from the post station, saying that the mountain road that had collapsed a few days ago had collapsed again, and the snow had converged into a torrent a few days ago, and it was washed away, and it was still impossible to go. Zhang Xuning sat in front of the window, supported by her hand, and after listening to Xiaobeo's words, she couldn't help but say, "Do you stay in Tongzhou during the New Year?" Xiaobeo put the hot tea on her and said, "Listen to what Mr. means, most of the time." Zhang Xuning frowned. Xiaobao said, "Xiao Qiuagong and they can't leave, and I discussed with my husband a few days ago, saying that on Chinese New Year's Eve, we should find a restaurant to hold a banquet and reward the sergeant, so as to comfort everyone's homesickness. If you're homesick, why don't you join in the fun? Homesick? Zhang Xuning snorted softly. She didn't miss home. When others celebrate the new year, they naturally want to go home. A whole family sat together for a reunion. Even if there were some entanglements and fights in the usual times, they all let go of it in this good day. Saying auspicious words to each other, setting off firecrackers, eating rice cakes, keeping the new year, and only hoping for a better year in the coming year are rare days of warmth in the world. But for her, it became more and more deserted. In the past, when I was in Zhuangzi in the countryside with Wan Niang, most of the rough farmers in the mountains and wilderness despised Wan Niang's background, although because they came from big families after all, they all had some places to ask Wan Niang, but secretly gave a lot of white eyes. Wan Niang also disdains to deal with rough people. Every Chinese New Year, every household is lively, but Wan Niang takes her to eat something at will. Even if she is old, she goes to sleep on the couch. She didn't know anything about it when she was younger, and she didn't think there was anything wrong. When I was a little older, I started to play with the children in the village and talked, only to find out that other people's families were going to celebrate the new year. One year, she went back to ask Wan Niang.
晚娘根本没搭理她。
Another year of the Chinese New Year, she couldn't help but go to other people's houses with other children, eat, set off firecrackers, and when she was about to sneak home at night, she opened the door and found that Wan Yang, who was supposed to go to sleep, was sitting in the house, looking at her coldly, and actually took her out of the door. It was dark and cold outside, and she was terrified. Raised his hand and patted the door vigorously, crying and asking Wan Yang why she didn't let herself in. Wan Niang still ignored it. She was tired of crying, so she leaned against the door and fell asleep in a daze, and the next morning she had a fever, so Wan Niang took her to see the doctor. Since then, Zhang Xuning has never dared to mention the new year. She was so scared. Later, when I returned to Jiang's house, I had to eat a reunion dinner every New Year's Day, but it always seemed to have nothing to do with her. Looking at flowers in the fog and looking at the moon in the water, it is not real across a layer. After all, she doesn't like Zhang Suiwai, and she doesn't like Meng. Everyone doesn't see each other on weekdays, but they have to block each other during the new year. Can they be happy? As for the later came to the palace. That's even more boring. The Chinese New Year's Eve banquet, the government and the opposition are concerned about the etiquette of the princes and courtiers, and the concubines are competing for beauty. Even if it is a happy day, everyone is also calculating each other. Where is the meaning? What's more, not everyone in the government and the opposition comes to the Chinese New Year's Eve banquet. Some of them have official positions that are too low to come. There are also some who can come but don't come by themselves. For example, Xie Wei, who was already a master of the court at that time, was sick almost every year, but he never arrived. For example, Zhang Sha, who does not eat oil and salt, always regards the emperor's grace as nothing, and once apologized for his sins and said that he would serve his mother at home. Yes, Zhang Xuning has not seen Zhang Sha on a day like the Chinese New Year's Eve festival. Putting her finger on the cold window edge, Zhang Xuning's heart suddenly jumped, and she turned her head and asked Xiaobao, "Where is Master Zhang?" Xiaobao was stunned for a moment. What? Zhang Xuning was suddenly a little nervous. Won't Lord Zhang return to the capital for the new year? Xiaobao only then knew what she was asking, and replied, "The day before yesterday, Master Zhang had someone ask about the snow and landslides in the Isle, and mentioned that he would go back in the snow, but the road was already dangerous before it was passed, not to mention that he still had injuries on his body, and the doctor said that he would have to raise it for a few days." Mr. Xie did not agree, only said that if Mr. Zhang had an accident, no one could afford it. Zhang Sha also wants to pass through the state as early as possible for the new year. A stream of hot air slowly gushed out from the bottom of her heart, and Jiang Xunning's fingers trembled. Xiaobao wondered, "Do you want to go back too?" Unexpectedly, Jiang Xunning didn't seem to hear it, and she didn't move, and after a while, she turned around and walked out directly, without even taking an umbrella. Xiaobao was taken aback. "Why are you going?" Jiang Xunning wanted to go out, but after walking a few steps, she remembered that she didn't know the road in Tongzhou City, and turned around and said, "Is there a good wine shop in Tongzhou?" Xiaobao. Jiang Xunning's face seemed to be lit up, and with this radiance, she actually smiled and said, "You take me there." Xiaobao didn't understand what she wanted to do. But the sword scholar has explained that he will take good care of the second girl Jiang and take good care of it, and don't make the same mistake as before. He didn't dare to let Jiang Xunning go to the city alone. Although she was full of suspicion at the moment, she had to take the umbrella and accompany her. The big restaurants in the city are not closed at this time, and there are also some good cooks who want to help some rich families make noodles for the new year. Jiang Mansion will invite the chef of Dai Yulu to make a good table in the mansion every New Year's holiday. Jiang Xunning knew that there was such a thing, so she asked Xiaobao to lead the way. On the way, I saw some shops still open, and most of them were New Year's goods. Originally, when she saw her a few days ago, she was not very interested, but this time she stopped and looked carefully, and even bought a few red lanterns, and bought a small bag embroidered with the word Fu, a good seal, and went to the silver number to exchange a handful of gold and silver bills cast into auspicious appearances such as Fu Gua Xiaoquo. Xiaobao watched from the side, wondering who she was going to give the new year. The two of them were delayed on the road for a while, and then they arrived at Xihalu, which is the best cooking in the city. When I asked the shopkeeper, I was able to invite the cook. It's just that the price is not low. It doesn't cost a lot of money to buy a lantern lucky bag, but there are a lot of seals and gold and silver bills. Jiang Xunning pulled the remaining silver taels in her hand and frowned. 100 taels, where is it so expensive? The shopkeeper was kind and explained to her, it's not a secret, the Osmanthus wine in this building is famous, and the price is not cheap, and there are not a few jars left this year. Other cooks have also been invited to other mansions for a long time, and the one who stayed behind is Master Su, the chef in our building, who was going to go back to his wife and children to warm the Kong. But when the business came to the door, of course, the price was not refused. If you can afford this price, I will help you say something. 100 taels is really not a lot of money for Jiang Xunning. In the past, I didn't blink an eye. She could see at a glance that the shopkeeper was taking the opportunity to raise the price and kill the customer, but for such a small amount of money, she couldn't afford to deal with him. With a roll of her eyes, she said, "It's okay. But I don't have so much silver with me, so you see I have the 20 taels left in my hand, and I'll pay you a deposit. The rest of them, later you send someone to Shangqing Guanfu, I will live there, and the Chinese New Year's Eve banquet will also be done there." The shopkeeper looked at her in surprise. The city has spread, and there is a big incident in Shangqingguan, and these days I have watched the sedan chair of the government go in and out in front of the temple. The people who live in Shangqingguan now are by no means ordinary people. He was respectful to Jiang Xunning and hurriedly agreed. Xiaobao looked at her, and stopped his greedy words. Out of the restaurant, Jiang Xunning asked him, "Why is this pale?" Xiaobao said, "It's too expensive, besides, where do you have so much money? You must know that the money Jiang Xunning has now is the 100 taels he gave before, which was given by Mr., and he doesn't have much on him. Just now, Jiang Xunning paid that price in one bite, it was." In short, Xiaobao feels unreliable. Jiang Xunning raised her eyebrows and smiled when she heard this, and she was a little embarrassed. "No money, Miss Ben has a lot of money." She took the seal, put all the gold and silver bills into the blessing bag, put them heavily in her sleeve and hid them so that no one else could see them, and then she walked briskly back to Shankingwan. These days, Xiawei didn't ask her to learn the piano. I heard that it was busy. After all, there are too many officials in Tongzhou who come to visit her, and they must not be able to find time to train her. And since 2 days ago, the young master claimed that he was sick, contracted a cold, and did not see outsiders. Zhang Xuning knew that this was a pretext. The power of an arrow can pass through a person's shoulder. How can he be a weak scholar who gets sick every winter? I thought it was just too lazy to entertain these officials in Tongzhou. As soon as she returned to Shankingwan, she walked to Xiawei's courtyard for the first time. Jianshu just came out of it with the cold tea that had been removed, and saw her as if he had seen a ghost. Why is the second girl here? Zhang Xuning coughed, looked at the closed door behind him, lowered his voice and asked, "Is Mr. asleep?" "It's a bit sneaky." Jianshu hesitated for a moment and said, "Sleep, do you want to see you?" No, 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 no. What are you kidding? Zhang Shui would rather not take the initiative to find death. She raised her hand and pulled the sword book aside. "I'll just tell you that." Jianshu saw her white hand pulling at her sleeve, her eyelids jumped, and a little chill rose in her heart, and said, "You speak, don't do it. Big men are so stingy." Zhang Xuning didn't think deeply, put down her hand, put on a very kind expression, and said, "You must have brought money with you when you come out with your husband, right? Just give 1,000 children and 800 taels of envoys." The corners of Jianshu's mouth twitched. "You." Zhang Xuning said in time, "You know." Jianshu said, "What do I know?" Zhang Shui would rather know that the sword, book, sword, and Qin were Xiawei's henchmen, and Xiawei's affairs were clear, so he crossed his waist. "Your husband still owes me tens of thousands of silver and hasn't paid it back. It's not too much for me to ask for 1,800 taels, right? I think your husband is infected with the cold, and his health is not good, so it is not easy to bother. And thou shalt give it to me, and turn back to him and tell him that is." Jianshu was afraid that he would be beaten to death by his own husband if he agreed to come down and turn around, but the master in front of him was really a little special, and he really didn't dare not give it, which really made him hesitate. Zhang Xuning urged him, "Otherwise, I will go and disturb your husband." Judging by their usual posture, it doesn't look like they dare to disturb Xiawei casually. She felt that she could get a sum of money of her own. But she didn't think about it. Jianshu stared at her for a long time, and said, "Then you can go." Zhang Xuning. "This is still the sword book I know?" She froze. The sword book turned around to knock on the door, but said, "I'll pass it on to you." Zhang Xuning was startled, and hurriedly pulled him. "Don't, what are you doing?" At this moment, the door that was still closed creaked open. Xiawei stood behind the door, his light robe was slowly strapped, his body was long, his hands were still on the edge of the door, as if he had just gotten up. A few strands of loose hair fell on the snow-white placket, and there was a little bit of laziness that was rare in his posture. However, there is a clear coldness between the eyebrows. His gaze fell on the two people in front of the door, and then fell on Zhang Xunning's hand that was still holding the sword book's arm. Zhang Xuning didn't feel anything. The sword book was looked at by this, but the cold hairs on his back stood up, as if he had walked in front of the palace of the king of Hades. He hurriedly pulled his hand back, bowed down, and said, "Sir, the second girl Ning has just." Xiawei said lightly, "I heard it." Zhang Xunning's back neck was cold. Raised his eyes to look at Xiawei, although his face was a little pale, but it really didn't look like he was so sick with wind and cold that he couldn't come out to socialize, so he suddenly deserted and muttered in his heart, "Sure enough, it's pretended." Xiawei looked at her. "Want money?" Zhang Xuning originally wanted to ask for Jianshu directly. Anyway, it is a fact that their husband owes him money, and there is no reason not to give it. Let them go back and tell Siawei. Siawei is not stingy with himself. Who would have thought that he would come out? She snorted. Yes, I heard that Mr. was sleeping, so I didn't dare to disturb him. I heard he was sleeping? Siawei knew that this little liar was full of truth, and he didn't bother to expose this little trick she used to put gold on her face, and asked her with a smile, "You are really worried about that money, what is the use?" Jiang Xuning opened her mouth to speak, but before she could speak, her cheeks were slightly red. Siawei was smiling, but when he saw her attitude, the temperature under his eyes gradually subsided, and although the smile on his lips was still there, he lost the taste of the spring breeze that made people feel like a spring breeze, and he actually saw through her, for Jiang Sha. She likes Jiang Sha, and it's not a secret here in Siawei. Jiang Xuning couldn't speak, but she was embarrassed. But since they were all guessed by Siawei, she also calmed down, thinking that Siawei knew anyway, so she raised her head and smiled. I still can't hide it from Mr. I think Mr. Jiang wanted to go home, but the heavy snow closed the road and couldn't go, so he wanted to stay in Tongzhou for the new year, so he wanted to plan well and be lively. Otherwise, I won't go out on New Year's Eve, and I'll be alone. Siawei saw her standing under the eaves, the corners of her eyes and eyebrows were like the branches and buds, and when she looked behind her, the snow in the courtyard that had time to be cleaned was dazzlingly white. There was a sneer in his heart. But the words were still gentle, "You are thoughtful." Jiang Xuning still thought he was praising himself, and said happily, "Then you agreed." Siawei smiled softly, "It's your money, and I want to give it to you."